So, good afternoon, everyone. It's my very great pleasure to introduce this session on India and the First World War. And we've got two excellent speakers with us here. Shrabani Basu will be familiar to many of you. She's been all over the festival already and has done so much on work about Indian history and its connections to Britishness. In the case of Queen Victoria, the wonderful film about Victoria and Abdul, which was Oscar nominated, which she was involved in. And for the purposes of this session, working on the First World War histories. And she wrote a book for King and Another Country, Indian Soldiers on the Western Front, 1914 to 18. Santanu is a scholar, an academic, previously based at King's College London, and recently moved to All Souls College, Oxford, where he's Professor of English Literature and a research fellow there. And Santanu has really done a labour of love over the last 10 years in researching India and its First World War experience. It's taken him all across the world, from Australia to Belgium to archives all over Britain, and we'll be talking about that. So we're here in 2019, and it's a really good moment to reflect on that 100 years since the end of the First World War. There's been so much attention over the centenary from 2014 to 2018. And I wanted to ask you both what you were doing, what your aims were, what you hoped to achieve by writing books about Indians and the First World War. Shrabani.
Well, I'd always been, can you hear me? Sorry, I've lost my voice a bit. I've always been interested in Indians and the war. So it was the Second World War that I really got into first. I wrote a biography of a World War II heroine, Yasmin Khan, in the Second World War. And that got me thinking about, all the wars and the Indians. And it was the centenary coming up, and I said, well, we're going to get a lot of books. We're going to hear about the Somme and the Luce and everything, and no one is going to talk about the Indians. And I felt I just had to do something. And that's how it started, really. And slowly, I'm not a military historian. For me, it's
Thank God.
It's all, there's a little bit of, fighting there, a lot of trenches. Thank everybody. You've taken, you've chosen to come to the trenches rather than watch cricket. So thank you. But I just felt that it's these personal stories that I had to explore. I would look at these photographs of these soldiers and think, they went 150, 1.5 million of them, combatants, non-combatants. Where did they come from? These villages in India didn't speak the language. Thrown into these trenches. What were they thinking? And all that sort of excited me, and that was the thought process that started it.
Now, I think Shrabani already kind of blazed the trail, and it's one of those things where I think the journalists and the common kind of public came before the scholars. When I was trying to do my book, I basically wanted to go beyond names of battles, beyond memorials. I wasn't that interested actually in how many Victoria Crosses India got. What I wanted to capture is the inner world of feeling. How did they feel when they first landed in Europe, when they were first transported to the trenches? And these men, they just didn't fight. They lived, loved, and I'm kind of quoting a line here, saw dawn and saw sunset glow. So basically, but both of us had this problem because these are non-literate men. Mm-hmm. How do we go about recovering the lives of these people? That was my one point, this underworld of feeling. Second, I also wanted to enmesh this kind of world of the First World War in a greater socio-historical and greater cultural landscape of India. Because the soldiers fall between this Eurocentric history of the First World War on one hand and the nationalist history of India, because they were fighting for the wrong side at that time. So that was the second thing, and I would say finally, also the contradictory histories, and this is where I think maybe I should say something about my own family. One of my great uncles, he didn't fight, thankfully, but served as a doctor in France, and he got the military cross and all that. And his own brother, he joined in 1930s the anti-kind of colonial revolutionary movement and was beaten to death in Presidency Jail in Kolkata. So from the same family, one brother serves, and it's a very familiar story. It's the Mir Mast Mirda story. So these things I tried to capture in the book, the contradictions, and I think kind of you do as well.
So give us a flavour of how hard it is to find these kinds of stories, these kinds of histories, because there's a paradox. On the one hand, you've got 1.4 million soldiers in the First World War. They're in all the major theatres of battle, 60 to 70,000
Dead.
And yet I don't remember really being taught about this at school. It's only in recent years that we've kind of seen this occurring in the kind of media sphere, I think, this First World War contribution. So how hard is it to get to these narratives, to these stories?
Well, the British Library, where we are seated right now. My goodness, the records. So unlike Santanu, actually, who said he wasn't interested in the VCs, I wanted to do the personal...
I was, I think. VCs and beyond.
You mean Victoria, the
Victoria
Cross.
Crosses, VCs and beyond.
Well, when you have 150,000, combatants, non-combatants, and I wanted to do personal stories, I didn't know where to start, frankly.
That's true. Sorry, I didn't mean it that
So I started with the short list of the 11 VCs, and then I decided to follow the stories of some of them. So I've covered some of them. One of them is Gabbar Singh Negi, and he was from Garhwal. Garhwal is in India. Some of you know the area. It's sort of north of Dehradun. And most people know about the Sikhs and the Gurkhas, and they don't know about the Garhwali regiment. Garhwali regiment got two of the men got 2 George Crosses, 2 Victoria Crosses, and several gallantry awards. So I sort of tracked him, and I went to his village, because there was no records, obviously. I just know he's got the Victoria Cross, that's the citation, and that's it. Went to the village, because you need those oral stories as well, and found his family, and they told me, and then all these stories just emerged. There's the Victoria Cross, which they've given, and they told me about, it wasn't just the combatants. I mean, he'd got this Victoria Cross in the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle, and he was killed. He led the charge through the trenches and won the trench, and then he was killed. His body was never found. And this news of his death went back to this village, all these thousands of miles away, and his wife, who was just 14 years old at the time, she received this news and the medal, which she couldn't read his name, she was illiterate. But the story they told me was so fascinating. She had the Victoria Cross, she pinned it on her sari, and she was just 14, she never remarried, and she would wear it all her life, pinned on her sari. It was a simple shepherd family in the hills. She would walk collecting firewood, carrying it on her head, and all the villagers would salute her, because they were saluting the Victoria Cross. She knew how important it was. And she lived to the ripe old age of 81 and was part of the memorial that they built in this little village. I went to the village. So it was, to cut it short, these were the stories that were coming up. And that I followed it, some of them through records here at the British Library, some through just tracing the families and the descendants and just getting this trail going, short list, and then following them. Not just the soldiers, but the Air Force. I didn't know there were Indians in the Air Force. So I followed their stories as well. 4 amazing our first pilots from India. So,
and Santanu, you found some individuals.
Yes, I have, but I thought I'd just clarify, because I think you do very exciting things about the Victoria Crosses rather than saying, he just got a Victoria Cross. That's a new way of opening up the story, because ultimately it's the intimate stories you are interested in. So Victoria Cross becomes like a starting point.
Of course. Yeah.
And I've also been kind of following some stories, and I'd just like to maybe play a voice recording, which perhaps is one of the most moving things. I'm a First World War, I guess, historian, and I've been working on it for almost 15 years. My first kind of book was on kind of European and British literature. But this is perhaps the most moving thing I've heard. Can I have the recording, please? This is the voice of Mal Singh, a prisoner of war, and this is from 1915. Can we be slightly loud? No. Sorry, it's not a very... Can we be slightly louder? No. Okay, this is better. And the translation, if you can see, it's there, the translation. Okay, I'll move on. and basically kind of Mal saying that this was in a prisoner of war camp in Wunstorf, kind of just outside Berlin. And he says that he misses the butter he used to have back in kind of Punjab. And this was part of a larger ethnological kind of experiment where these Indians, you can see the picture here, they were asked to basically speak something or narrate a story. And this is where again brings me back to the whole question of non-literacy. So I think that the first thing I learned that the moment we step outside Europe, we have to look at a far greater variety of sources, go beyond the text into objects, images, sound recordings, songs. And there is also another picture here, maybe I don't know how prominent it is. There it shows that a soldier is basically putting his thumbprint to accept his pay. And again, we realize this is because he's non-literate. And I'll just take you through maybe two more images if you can see them. If I can see them, it's better. Yes, this is a letter I first saw in an exhibition here at SOAS. This is written by an 11-year-old Punjabi girl writing to her dad saying that she's learning how to read and write so that when she receives letters from the trenches, she doesn't have to take it to the postmaster anymore. She can read it out directly to the mother. So here she says that, Daddy, you can write whatever you want to my mother because I will read it out. And just two more things. This is very, very rude. I don't know whether you can read it, but this is fascinating. This is a page from the trench notebook of a man called Mir Mast. He was an Afridi kind of Pathan who defected onto the German side in May 1915. So, and his diary was confiscated and was a sealed envelope. And when I was in Delhi and I was given permission to open it, I thought it would be full of words like jihadi, nationalism, Bharat. And here you see it's full of body parts, female intimate body parts. And you realize when this 22-year or 23-year-old men, when in the trenches, what they were thinking or learning. And the other, this is the final one. Here are two things. On the left-hand side, it's a diary from an Australian soldier where an Indian had written his name in 3 languages, Gurmukhi and Urdu and English. And he suddenly realized how these languages were close to each other, very different from what we are having now. There was no sanitization of the linguistic or religious boundaries in Punjab at that time. And on the right, you have this pair of broken glasses I came across in Chandernagore, and in fact, Shrabani has also written about it. And then later on, I didn't know at that time, I just kind of came across by accident this pair of broken glasses. They were shipped across to Chandernagore after this man had died in France. And then I was giving a paper in Leeds when a man from the audience, he stood up and he said, my God, his name is there in the memorial just outside the classroom where I was lecturing. And then I realized that he was the only non-white member of the Leeds Pals Battalion. And I just wanted to share this so as to say that these are just, fugitive fragments, and we have to collect them in order to understand the history and also know what questions to ask, like the one you have done with Kasturi Devi, like going to the villages. So we have to be anthropologists and sociologists.
Yeah, well, the thing at the British Library was, the one thing that was the most fascinating here are the letters. And Santanu shows that image of, because they were illiterate, so they needed somebody to write the letter. And on the other hand, they needed somebody to read that letter. And these letters were translated. They were censored, of course, which is why we have them. So we have the translated editions, annotated with all the notes. The ones that are not going to clear the censors aren't sent. And we know the ones that aren't sent. And we can see these letters in that one. And they are so beautiful. They are so moving. There's just hundreds and thousands of letters. One of my favorites, Yasmin, is this Pathan who is an injured soldier he's in the hospital in Rouen, and he's writing, all I want is a flute to play on. And it's just such a moving letter that he writes that, please send me a flute, put it in this box, wrap it with cotton wool, send it to me here, and I will, it's all I want. And what happens, the funny thing is there's this comfort committee, which actually looks after, they do good work, they look after the needs of the Indian soldiers. They want to make sure they're really looked after, they get all the things they want, spices, tea, hair oil, dant manjar, everything, the works. And they see this letter, and because they're censoring all the letters, and they say, oh, let's get him this flute. And a mix-up happens, and they send him a little tin whistle, and he's a bit disappointed. But then the actual letter goes, and they go to Boozy and Hawks, and they get him the best flute, and he suddenly receives this, and it's just beautiful that he plays it in the hospital. So more and more letters were a big source.
I mean, I think you've both shown it's not just because there are non-literate people. Through working with these fragments, you can actually sort of get to a lot, and you've kind of put that there and actually kind of almost pieced back together this puzzle, which is extraordinary. But you mentioned the Comforts Committee and the efforts that have gone to make soldiers comfortable, but there is a kind of side to this where we wonder about the relationships between white British soldiers and officers in particular and the men. And I mean, could you talk a bit about that, the social mixing, the fact that this is in the context of an imperial war?
Absolutely. So this Comfort Committee is set up and it's headed by one of the old India hands. And the reason for it is that given their experience in the mutiny, they wanted to make sure there is no problem. Hindus, Muslims, the mutiny had started with the greased pork. I mean, all of you know that background. So they wanted to make sure nobody has any complaints. We don't want to see any trouble. And so every effort is made to see they get their religious books. The Muslims, they have their halal meat. The Hindus have the meat they slaughter. They have different slaughterhouses. They make sure that they get all their religious books. The amount of Sikh Qurans that are sent to them, little Qurans which are pocket size, which they can carry with them, turban covers for the for the waterproof. It's just raining non-stop in the trenches. And there is this war going on, but the little details are always that I take away. And there are these meetings which go on where they say the Sikh soldiers don't like these sugar candy sweets. They want these sweets called pinnies, which are sweets made with nuts and almonds and very sort of high calorie, high energy sweets. And there's these meetings. There's a war going on. There's meetings and meetings. How do we get these pinnies to the Sikh soldiers? Minutes of these meetings, shall we source them in Britain? Shall we source them there? And finally the meetings go on and they say, what about getting somebody from India to make, because it's expensive to get it from Britain, the costs aren't working. Shall we get somebody from India to make these pinnies? And I had this vision of, there's like rockets flying a few meters away. There's a man sitting here making pinnies to feed the soldiers. I mean, the whole thing was so bizarre in some context, but this was happening. And, well, of course, there is this, but there's also the whole thing that the white nurses are not going to treat wounded Indian soldiers. So there's a whole lot of, behind the scenes going on. White Indian women can't come to the hospitals. And you have more on the racism in your book, I know, Santanu. So
yes, I think it's a very mixed thing. It's not a black and white picture because I think what I find very moving about this story about these sweets, there are these pockets of genuine affection, genuine, caring, and intimacy. On the other hand, there's this bigger structures of completely institutionalized racism, so that we have the Brighton Pavilion Hospital, where on one hand, I think the Indian sepoys are getting better medical care than the working class Tommies. On the other hand, I also remember this letter where this man writes, we get everything, we get food, we get the best medical treatment, but we don't have the essential thing, freedom, because there's a fence around the Brighton Pavilion Hospital so that the soldiers, the Indian soldiers can't leave, and it's because of the fear of miscegenation, of Indian men having sexual relationship with British women, which would compromise the prestige of the Raj. Or, for example, if we go to Mesopotamia, I came across this fantastic, absolutely amazing 300-page memoir by an Indian Indian orderly who became a prisoner of war and learned Turkish and was basically dragged from one prisoner of war camp to another across the Middle East for 4 years, and then he came back and wrote this memoir called Abhila Baghdad. And he says that everything is different. Our salaries are different, our uniforms are different. When we have tea, the British soldiers get sugar, whereas we get molasses in the tea. On the other hand, at the same time, I would say there were lots of British officers who were really attached to their men. So I think that we cannot just create this black and white picture. There were these individual pockets of intimacy and affection. within a greater structure because it's a colonial world.
Of course, of course.
And within that greater structure, how does India's role in the war actually change things? Because I mean, we've heard a lot at this festival about Amritsar. I mean, it's also the centenary of the Amritsar massacre, and so that comes just at the end of the war.
Absolutely.
So what's the connection there?
And there's a direct connection, in fact, because it's actually in the aftermath of the Amritsar massacre that Gandhi writes the report on the Punjab disturbances, where he talks about the forced recruitment in 1917 and 1918, which actually contributes to the whole protests against the Rowlatt Act, because already the whole situation in Punjab is completely incandescent. Because, for example, women would be often kidnapped and kept hostage till the men would come back and be forcibly recruited. Or this is an agricultural economy, so suddenly the farmers would wake up and realize that the water to their particular plot of land has been discontinued because they haven't satisfied the basic quota of recruitment. So this is the backdrop of the disturbances of 1918 and which leads on to Amritsar massacre. So there is a link. At the same time, I'm slightly worried about making a direct trajectory of the soldiers coming back, getting radicalized, and then taking part in the nationalist movement, because history doesn't work like that. It's much more messy. I wonder.
Yeah, for me it was shocking because you see the records, and it's while the peace talks are going on in Versailles. It's 5 months into the peace talks, and then you have Jallianwala Bagh. And it's barely mentioned at the peace talks. It's like one line, that there were some disturbances in Punjab, and that's it. It's written off. That really hit me because, this is the whole reason that the Indians supported the war. The Indian sort of, the Congress leadership at that time, whatever, and the princely states and everybody, the bargaining thing they thought they would get out of this war would be home rule, just like South Africa and Australia and the others. And instead of home rule, I mean, they did get a few concessions from the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, but there they had the Rowlatt Act. And it was like a slap on the face and it happens on the holiest day of the Sikhs. One of the people I talk about in my book is Hardeep Singh Malik, and he is the first Indian pilot. He is somebody who, now the pilots are a different class because they're not the soldier class. You see, these are men from the elite families who came here. They have to be officers, so they studied in Cambridge. They are the wealthy elite of India. And he just wanted to be, he wanted to join in those days it was still not the RAF, it was the Royal Flying Corps, RFC, thank you. So he really wants to get in, and they said no, because they don't want an Indian there. And then he goes to France. He fights his way, and then his tutor in Oxford, the French want to recruit him because he's so good. And then his tutor in Oxford writes on his behalf and says, this is nonsense that these young men, this young man, a bright young man like him, is not getting a chance. So Hardeep Singh Malik becomes the first pilot, wearing his turban, and he's a super pilot. But to come back to Jallianwala Bagh, that is the day, it's the holiest day, Baisakhi. The war's over, he's gone back, he's going to marry his sweetheart, and his wedding day is on the Baisakhi day. And he writes that, there's curfew, his wife couldn't get the dress, and it's all, and then he watches them bombing after Jallianwala Bagh. Jallianwala Bagh was bad enough. What happened afterwards was there was this aerial bombing that happened, and he watches the same aircraft, Sopwith Camel aircraft. I got to learn a lot about aircraft that he was flying. Now bombing his own people. So all these, they're just stories that just get
Also, when the soldiers were here for the victory parade, they were not told, deliberately not told about Jallianwala Bagh massacre. So they were kept in ignorance. And to come back to a previous point you raised about them being non-literate, so I just thought of mentioning one thing that I found fascinating. They were non-literate, but they were intensely literary because they had grown up listening to stories, listening to kissas, poems. So that one thing that I found very moving. The letters that Shrabani was mentioning, they are very poetic. Like, for example, they say that bullets are flying about like little drops of rain in the monsoon. Or, for example, there is kind of like
tired bullocks.
Like tired bullocks and bull buffaloes in the month of Bhadar. Sola is the weary world. Our hearts are breaking. Sorry, I just kind of
No, I think it's important that there's that creative impulse that's linked to the war, and I think that's something that you both bring out. But we know a lot about the trench poets for the First World War in Europe,
Exactly.
and about Owen and Sassoon. And I think there is a kind of creative impulse which is generated by the war also. I mean, there's a literary impulse which is even for the non-literate folk. You know?
It is. I think the problem is that people try to find a Pakistani Owen or a Bengali kind of Sassoon, and I think that's not going to do. It's a very different kind of literary formation. So on one hand, we have the letters. Then over the last 10 years, we have found more and more memoirs and diaries which are very moving. But then there are wonderful jewels like the short story Usne Kaha Tha, written in 1915, and I think it may be one of the earliest. I know the earliest, kind of the first short story written in Hindi, but it's one of the earliest short stories written about the war anywhere in the world. Then you have Tagore giving his fantastic lectures on nationalism, which are more relevant today than maybe in any other kind of era. He's giving that, in the States. Then you have Iqbal writing on it. Then you have Kazi Nazrul Islam. So you have the kind of who go on to become the national poets of the three countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, all writing about the war. So there's this fantastic literary output, and it's a shame that we don't really know much about it because we are completely fixated by Owen and Sassoon.
Well, on the subject of Tagore and Owen, of
Yes,
course, there is this beautiful link, because when Wilfred Owen, Tagore had just won the Nobel Prize for Gitanjali at this time in 1911, and Wilfred Owen had read this, and he had a copy of one of his poems with him. So when Wilfred Owen was found, his body was found, his notebook had a poem from Gitanjali in it, which was then returned to his mother, and she wrote to Tagore, that this is what my son quoted your poems on the day he left. It's just beautiful. It's in the book.
It's beautiful. Huh?
And he quoted these lines before he left, as we stood and we looked at the coast. And these were his last words to me. And then this, your poem has been returned back to me.
Exactly. And the lines were Jabar, I'll say in Bengali and then in English, Jabar dine ei kothati bole jeno jai, ja dekhechi ja peichi tulona tahar noy. When I go from hence, let this be my parting word, that what I have seen is unsurpassable. I mean, it's just beautiful lines, and that's the last things Owen said to his mother, to whom he wrote some 500 letters. So, kind of just before he left.
Before he died. So so there is this link of the two poets coming together as well, which is amazing.
There's this other story that apparently this Gurkha man was kind of taken captive by this kind of big German officer, and he was terrified, and apparently he was trembling hysterically. And the German said the only thing he knew, the only word, he said, Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore, and the Gurkha stopped trembling. So this is the cultural capital in a military world.
But it gives a sense of how interconnected those worlds are and how close they are. They're not necessarily separate. Just going back to our humble sepoy though, and beyond the world of Tagore, why did people join up? I mean, there's a question that's always asked, because you mentioned the quotas and the sense that people are being coerced in a way into joining the
Not initially, not in 1914, 1915. It was voluntary recruitment, though I guess a big question mark hangs over the word voluntary. When people are so poor, you're getting just 11 rupees. But I think that increasingly, over the last kind of maybe 10 years, the sepoys are either turned into loyalist kind of warriors or into this kind of cannon fodder, or maybe seasoned mercenaries. And I think the truth lies somewhere in between, because army was a source of livelihood. It was the biggest source of livelihood in Punjab. Your father had been in the army, your grandfather had been in the army. It was related to izzat, a problematic word. It was related to masculinity. And we scholars spend our life deconstructing izzat, which means, honor. And then I went to this recruitment village called Bonsi, kind of near Delhi. And, I said, izzat is rubbish. It's all a colonial construct. And when I was leaving, all this kind of veterans and their kind of descendants had come in. I was given a military salute, and I was told in Hindi, we are warriors. We are born to fight. So it may be a case of them having internalized the colonial ethos, but we can't write them off completely.
Of course. I mean, it was 11 rupees, a uniform, a rifle, and boots.
Yes.
3 meals a day. That was the basic. Do you have that poster?
I have got a picture. You carry on.
So there were posters like this. Who wants this? Is that the one you have?
No, I'll bring it. I have it.
There is, as the war went on, they started these posters for recruitment in the regional languages. So you have them in Punjabi, you have them in Urdu, and one of them is this soldier, and he's holding a. There he is. Yep,
on the
he's
left.
holding a. Who will get this money? No, who will get this gun? Who will get this uniform? And you will. And
those who volunteer.
Those who volunteer, and you will get this money. And at the end, it's really quite crude. There's this hand.
Yeah.
And so this is later years of the war. Initially, it's all join up, join the for king and country, empire, India's place in this. And also we have the native princes who are really loyal. So they want to all send their imperial troops. They are the first. The Maharaja of Bikaner is the first to go in. The Maharaja of Mysore sends ambulances and soldiers. So they are going. And the recruitment follows. I mean, the mobilization offers come. India has the largest standing army at this stage. So before the other colonies can mobilize, Australia, New Zealand, Canada are going to send their troops much later. Indian army is standing ready. They fought in Afghanistan. They are ready. Within months, by war breaks, 4th of August, by 26th of September, they've reached Marseille. That's the day they land in Marseille.
And we also realize how cruel that world is, because these princes and many of the nationalist leaders like Gandhi took an active part in recruitment in 1918. He went from village to village recruiting, and then in 1919 he calls the same men hired assassins of the Raj, which may say something about a part of Indian nationalist history. But to go back to this point, the poster that Shrabani mentioned, alongside that there is a song saying that if you stay here, you will get just old rags. If you go to fight, you will get suits. Then if you are here, you will get chappals. If you go there, you will get shoes. So there is this kind of incentive, and they were not told at all about the actuality of battle, so that when the letters start coming back, then this kind of soldier writes back from France, don't come to this war in Europe. So there is this element of deception also happening in 1917 and 1918.
And in a strange way, it's Groundhog Day all over again for the Second World War. Because,
Absolutely. I was thinking
18 rupees, 15 would be sent back to the family in remittance.
Exactly.
You've got exactly the same kind of, perhaps there's more experience of the First World War to draw on, but at the same time, in many ways, people are attracted by exactly the same things. It's 3 meals a day, it's a uniform, and it's a state job. It's a reliable job.
Country, money, in a way. And some of the same songs. Like some of the songs that the women sung, the folk laments after the men had left or died, those songs were revived in the Second World War, and they just kind of replaced the names of the battles and the places. So it's the same tune, same lyric with just different names.
One of these propaganda, they would make these postcards, propaganda postcards, which I have some photos in the book. They're amazing, of these soldiers sitting or lying in the pavilion in Brighton beneath these chandeliers. And they made some 20,000 copies of these postcards and sent them back for recruitment, saying, you come to England and you lie in this King's Palace.
King's Palace.
I mean, forget it. Obviously, that the truth was something totally different. And then they were very clever. They would also, because the king would always come personally and present the Victoria Crosses to those who'd received it. So one of those was Mir Das.
The brother of my Mir Mast.
Yes. So he had he got it for being really brave during the gas attack in Ypres, and he's lying in the jail. He gets this award. He stands up from his wheelchair. He wants to receive it himself. He gets the award. Photographs are taken of the king giving it to him. And then it is used for recruiting English soldiers, because they say this is to shame those. At that time, I think it wasn't yet compulsory. So they use that to recruit. If this Indian can come and get this, it's to shame English soldiers and recruit them. So wheels within wheels, and so much going on to recruit, to keep. As late as 1918, March, I've seen these letters where they're saying we need 150,000 more. And one of the governors writes, okay, we're running out. We may now have to release the prisoners from the jails and send them there. So it's
Now,
getting
prisoners
that.
were taken from the jails because I've looked at the files in Calcutta, like for example, the porters and all that.
Yeah.
But to go back to Mir Das, there's this very sad letter saying, I've got the Victoria Cross, but this, he said, uses the word dhua, smoke. This dhua gives me no peace. I can't sleep because he was very badly gassed. And he says that I'm in a terrible, terrible state, and obviously that letter is held back. So
Yeah, absolutely. And he's, Mir Das story is amazing because of Mir Mast,
they're
the
two
two brothers.
brothers.
One
So
crosses over in New Chapelle. And what makes him want to go? I mean, Shantanu is an expert on Mir Mast, so, tell them the story.
he goes on this extraordinary jihadi mission. So he goes on with another 8 kind of Afridi Pathans, crosses over to the German side. Then he's part of a larger German mission to Istanbul. He goes to Istanbul there, so he crops up again in records and archives in Istanbul. From there, he's sent to Kabul to convince the Emir of Afghanistan, who had been so far neutral, to join the Allied side. And after that, he goes back home to Tira. And after all of this, he catches the Spanish flu and dies.
And I think he just wanted to go back home. It was exhaustion. It was not a jihadi spirit
Exactly.
that led him at all. It was just, he'd had enough and he just wanted to go
I
home.
remember in a previous talk, I remember you mentioning this phrase, he had just given up. And that's what I think, more than jihadi, he had just completely reached the end of his tether and he just wanted to be out of it.
And in fact, the number of deserters actually, which again I found really interesting, very few.
Very few.
Compared to how many English soldiers who had also given up, completely young boys who were shot at dawn. The number of deserters from the Indian Army, much
Is
less.
that just because it's so far to go back though? Because I always think there's that sense for the
there is
desertion,
a short,
it's-
there may be a shortcut, and this is a
There
very
is.
controversial thing, and I'm not going to make any friends among the Indian military contingent here, if there are any. I'm not making any judgments or not even hinting, I'm just stating facts. In September and October, there's a very high number of fingers going, kind of people being shot on their kind of middle fingers. And they were accused of having self-malingered, of self-mutilated, kind of self-mutilations. And again, I don't think the Indians are an exception because I've looked at records in the French army and the British army, and that's the first 2 weeks. They've just come from India, still in their cotton tunics, and they're shoved into the trenches in the face of kind of an industrial kind of battle. And what they often do is that this middle finger is kind of shot. So we have all these men, and on the left hand, not on the right hand. That is quite interesting. So we have all these pictures of them with bandaged kind of left hands. And then 6 men were court-martialed and executed, and the rate drops.
There are letters where they ask for things to be sent to them, and these letters are not, send certain things, which if I put
I love them.
They
Like,
will
put
make
some-
you ill.
exactly.
So detailed letters. I mean, did they think they would get through? But of course, they had their codes as well. Black
Yes,
pepper,
black
red,
pepper,
red pepper.
but also they said how to get conjunctivitis or something. So put something in your eye and the eye will get inflamed. Put something into your
Foot,
foot
foot.
and it will kind of
So there's
won't heal.
We're kind of running close to time, but I wanted to ask you, because of this centenary and the amount of attention, because I think there has been a good deal of attention in the press and the media. In part, you're both responsible for that. How do you feel about the way it's been covered? The India's role in the First World War. Have there been missed opportunities? Are there things that could have been done differently? Are there stories that we still need to be telling?
You go first.
Shall I go first? Okay. Well, I think it is fantastic that the color of war memory is no longer white. That is amazing. And a number of people, and I would say kind of Shrabani is at the forefront, who's trying to get kind of the Indian soldiers and the story of the Commonwealth participation in school curriculum. That's absolutely amazing. And in fact, you had, apart from your book, you had also written about it extensively in newspapers. On the other hand, among the British establishment, I think it's done in good faith, but I'm slightly worried that often the Indian contribution gets conflated. Commemoration slips into celebration very easily, and the Indian contribution gets conflated into this rhetoric of heroism and martyrdom and nationalism. So memory is being almost instrumentalized for this multicultural recruitment, current recruitment, and I find that very, very worrying, because already, there is a lot of nationalism around, and we can do maybe a bit less of war. So I find that quite worried, because on the 11th I was kind of doing a radio program, and I was there with one of the assistants of Boris Johnson, who was the mayor at that time. This is 2014, and he said, I'm a Sikh, and this is a call out to all Sikhs to join. So I think we need to be quite careful about what we remember and how we remember, rather than just saying we remember.
Yeah, well, I feel there was a lot of conversation, which is great, but I feel a lot more needs to be done. I mean, I grew up in India, I knew nothing about it. My daughters went to school here, they knew nothing about it. So obviously both countries are at fault for not having it in their curriculums, so that's one thing. I hope that this has started a conversation, we'll see more, but I do hope, like Santanu, it goes in the right way, because I feel that Hindus, Muslims fought together. It was a South Asia, it was India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. It was a whole South Asian thing. For me, pre-war is seeing this unity. And I think if we focus on that, and that itself becomes a really healing point, as all these conflicts go on. So I think a little more of our togetherness in this would be good. And remembering our faults as well, and also remembering for me, there's all this darkness of the war, and you just want to find a few good stories, because you need something to live with. So, can I take 2 minutes on my favorite character?
Suka. Exactly.
So, Suka's story, which I have to share with you, and I've shared him, he's become quite famous now, good for him. He's, he was so this is an army of what do they call, the followers, so they're not combatants. But when the Indian army went, they needed cooks and cleaners, because the Hindus would eat separately, the Muslims would eat separately, the whole army is traveling with them. And Suka was what in India is called the untouchable, the lowest of the low caste. He was a sweeper. And he came, he swept the trenches, he came here to the hospitals. Suka, by a few months, by January of 1915, he was ill, and Suka died. He died in a hospital in Bournemouth. But that wasn't the end of the story. I found Suka in the hospital files, these comfort committee files that I was looking into, and they didn't know what to do with Suka. And that was the fascinating story. So they sent him to the Hindus, and they said, cremate him, as they were doing in Brighton. And they had a cremation cart over there. They would cremate the bodies. Hindus didn't want him. They said, he's untouchable. We're not going to cremate him. They sent him to the Muslims, to Woking, where the Muslims were being buried. And the Imam said, he's not a Muslim, we're not burying him. So Suka was lying in no man's land, created by his own countrymen. And then, well, it ends okay. The vicar of Brockenhurst, which is where he died, the hospital, so the little church there, he said, Suka died for this country, and we will bury Suka. And Suka, the parishioners raised the money for Suka. He's buried there. His grave is the largest, he has the largest gravestone, because his entire life history, which is about 10 lines, born there, died there, that's it. We have no name, he has no second name. In the records, he's called Suka Kallu, and Kallu is not even a name. It means something, he was obviously dark skinned, they just called him Daki, Kala means black, they just called him like a blackie. And that's it. So there is a happy ending. Suka is there. Now Suka, this faceless man, is known around the world. So it's nice. I mean, I think we take away a little hope from whatever good we get. Thank you.
I think we will open it now to the floor for questions. Gentleman here in the first row. Just if you could just wait for the microphone to come.
Sorry, it's a very short comment. It's not a question, really. And the comment is, when you said you grew up in India, you studied there, and you didn't know much about the history, recent history. And children growing up here do not know about the recent history. And I think the major shift in that thing has been Dr. Shashi Tharoor's book, Inglorious Empire. When I read that book, and I spoke to my friends who had read that book, we were all utterly surprised. And the book came out, as I'm sure you all know, the book came out after his Oxford University debate, in which he gave that talk, which then went viral. And so I think Indians, rightly so, and so as the British, completely ignorant about recent past, which is quite surprising.
The lady,
yes, lady.
Was there a similar anti-war left-wing movement in India as there was in Europe? Just wondered.
Not much, but Tagore was completely anti-war. So Tagore's lectures on nationalism, he links empire and war. And that's why Tagore did not write anything ever about the soldiers. It's amazing that he lives to this whole period. He never writes a short story or a poem, anything about the soldiers. He was completely anti-war.
But there was also this Ghadar movement
Yes,
in US,
Exactly.
and they were, they were quite very anti-war,
Anti-war.
and they wanted to distribute leaflets purely because they were opposed to British rule. So there was that angle looking into it, and the British censors were very wary of any newspapers coming from California that was on the list of mail that should not enter this country. So there was the Ghadar movement, which is happening in the US.
It's
And that
anti-war, but not pacifist. Like they were also very happy to use violence against British.
So it was in the context of British rule.
Got it.
Yes. It's my kid.
Thank you. I understand that these people, these who were recruited, had absolutely no understanding or preparation for war, how to use a gun and all that. Maybe a little bit, but I mean, they, as you say, they were used for cannon fodder. They were the people who went forward and really were, they were sitting targets, really. So a lot of casualties, many casualties. Also, the recruitment process is that there was somebody who was recruiting them, and they got money for recruiting these people. So they got quite a bit of money, and there was a lot of pressure simply because that it became a business kind of transaction, you can say. So I'm just wondering about that. The fact is that the business element of it, because there was during the time there was poverty, and these people were trying to look for some way of working, and this was on the table as an offer making some kind of money.
Of course, there is a lot of that. In fact, men were being bought and sold, sometimes by these lambadars or kind of these intermediaries, but the pressure was coming from the colonial government.
Of course. But I would never buy, there are some people who say, they were just mercenaries, they joined up for the money. I would never buy that, because one of the Darwan Singh Negi, another Garwali who was awarded the VC, the king, when he presented them, would always ask, what do you want? Do you want land? What present can we give you? This man who's from Garhwal, illiterate, had come to the army. He doesn't ask for land or anything. He says, I would like you to build a school in the village I come from. And they did build that school. That school is still standing, and it is now a secondary school. But the point is that he realized the value of education when he came, and he knew that they had to have education. And it's completely selfless. He asked for a school. So he was no mercenary.
Similarly, many of the soldiers, they would send back home money saying that our girls should also be educated, not just our boys. And this is something we have watched and learned in France. So, there are all these kind of side effects happening, saying that our women should be as educated as our men.
The first schools for girls started very shortly after this. There was the whole thing to educate women.
Absolutely, and Tagore in fact got the idea, and Tagore creates this walled university in Shantiniketan, and he gets the idea during the First World War, because he says the way to combat war is by educating people, and this is when he's in Japan, and through the money he has earned from these lectures in America, and then later the Nobel Prize, he creates Vishwabharati. So there is a direct link also with education.
But it sort of runs both ways as well, because it's a way of recruiting people. It's the deferred promise of development. You're going to get irrigation, and you will get education, and you will get
private education. What Shrabani is saying is like individual soldiers rather than the colonial government.
Right.
I guess.
Determined. So he also wanted a rail line. We never got that.
A rail line, really?
To his village, because
he
had to walk 4 days to reach his village.
I see.
And so he said a railway line, and they kept promising. But by then the Second World War happened, and that was it was thrown out. All right.
Other questions?
Yep. Good.
My grandfather fought in First World War on the Somme, and I've just been going through his archive, and I have a photograph of some Indian soldiers. Is there any way I can find out anything about them?
From the photograph?
Yeah.
Well, the regiment is what
From
you
the
need.
regiment, exactly.
You would need the
You
regiment.
need the regiment, and then actually there's quite a good database. It is possible.
Yeah,
It is
National
absolutely
Archives,
possible.
you would find soldiers from the regiment, the time period, you would be able to
Exactly,
find.
and the Imperial War Museum and the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, they have this big site. So if you could have some bits of information, there is a good chance of that. They would be in the cavalry, because the Indian infantry would have left by then.
Yeah, yeah.
So that would narrow down your search. It's the cavalry. Can you?
Did any of the war poets, in any of their writings or letters, refer to the Indians around them?
Yes, Edmund Blunden, Siegfried Sassoon, and Robert Graves. All three of them refer to the Indian soldiers. Kipling has a whole book called The Eyes of Asia, and Kipling actually had access to the letters of the soldiers, and there's this very moving letter in a way. It's a counterpoint to the story that Shrabani was telling us. This Indian soldier writes back home saying that, I've got a French mother. I'm billeted with this kind of elderly French woman who had lost 3 sons in the war. And I'm all she has got now. And when I left, she cried on my shoulder, and I've never seen her cry when one of her own sons left. And then she shoved a 5-franc note in my hand and said, "My child, spend it." And Kipling then uses that in a propaganda text, a sort of propaganda text called The Eyes of Asia. But just to tell another little vignette, because there were all these things happening within the Indians themselves. So again, to touch upon the point that Shrabani was saying, that the different religious groups were coming together. This is a letter from a man who is changing trains in Marseille. And he said that, changing trains in Gare du Nord in Paris. And he says, there were 7 of us who went to have a little tour of Paris. There were 2 Hindus, 3 Muslims, and 2 sweepers. And all of us sat at the same table and shared our meal. So on one hand, while the world is splintering, men in individual pockets were also coming together.
And in fact, we were talking about the commemorations now, Yasmin, which you picked up. And one of the things that sort of I didn't really quite like was the fact that you had the Sikh soldiers saying the Sikhs in the war, the Muslims going the Muslims in the war. I don't even know if the Hindus were going Hindus in the war, but for me, I said, let's just do,
and there's a global element to that as well, of course, because of the Chinese and the North Africans. I mean, there's a kind of
absolutely,
a lot of parallels.
Absolutely, but even within India, they're splintering into religious groups.
So
Absolutely.
that is, they fought together. It should be the Indian army in the war, and we all know the Indian army is the united India at that time. So.
Like
the commemoration should have been bringing together rather than splintering into religious.
Exactly. Because there's a huge statue of this soaring, valiant, gallant Sikh erected here, and then pulled down or vandalized after a few days by someone who had sympathies kind of with the Gadar things. So.
I would rather see a memorial for all Indian soldiers together. All the communities they represent, and that is the meaning of this. So.
Sorry, we just got one here.
Which one? The one he is talking about, the Sikh.
In Birmingham, there isn't one. In Birmingham, there's a very, very beautiful one to the missing in Neuf Chapelle. It's one of the most, but that was created in 1921 by the British.
That's got the names of the dead.
Names of the dead.
And then there's the memorial gates in London, aren't there?
Yes, the Commonwealth, the Commonwealth soldiers, and more
the
recently the Garden of Remembrance on the site of some graves.
Right. Yeah.
Lady here.
First, thank you for sharing your thoughts. I think you've touched upon it a little bit in terms of the motives of people for joining the army. When you were researching, what are the sentiments of the families now and the people around them, especially because we hear all about the bravery of soldiers in post-independence war and the pre-independence war, and there's a whole lot of propaganda in India, which I'm not going to go into, but the sentiments of people now, is it pride, is it regret, is it especially of people around the families of those who fought?
Oh, a lot of pride. All the families I spoke to were, of course, those who had gone to the war, and they were showing me all the records, and one of them was a beautiful, another story was, Manta Singh. Manta Singh is the 15th Ludhiana Sikhs. He comes from, so I met his family. He comes from Punjab. He comes with his officer, and who is a friend of his, and they both go to war. Neuf Chapelle, he finds his officer has been shot, and he doesn't think about it. He just goes there, puts him on a wheelbarrow, brings him back, gets a bullet in the leg for it. they're both sent back to England. Officer survives, Manta Singh dies. But because the officer knew that Manta Singh's, he was there because of Manta Singh's sacrifice, the families become friends. He makes sure that Manta Singh's son then joins the same regiment. And it's 3 generations. So I learned, and I met the 3rd generation who live here, who go together to the Brighton Memorial, where they have a service every year. And the 2 descendants of these families, they lay the grandsons of Manta Singh and the other one, they lay their flowers. So there is a lot of pride, and there is in many ways a lot of coming together. If you see the old soldiers' families, they do come together. But I'm sure even those who died, like Gabbar Singh's family, they were so proud of his VC. There was no regret.
I would say that kind of mostly pride partly depends on the families. On a couple of occasions I've come across regret. This is when I interviewed the Punjabi novelist Mohan Kalo, who's kind of, I think 2 of his kind of uncles died in the First World War, and the family didn't even get to know kind of when or exactly where in Mesopotamia they died. And his grandmother went mad, clinically mad with grief, so that their house became known as the Pagal Khana, meaning the asylum. So he said that for my family it is just one of kind of unending grief. So there is that. On the other hand, I remember in the same trip I met this other person whose grandfather was a recruiter rather than a soldier, Patram, and this grandson said, actually we got a lot of coins because my grandfather helped in recruitment, and after the grandfather died, my grandmother made them into a necklace, and a bit like Saturi Rebi, should parade up and down and people would salute, and then just before the partition, she used them to buy land in Pakistan, where part of the family went. So these are, go back to the Second World War, and they're all interconnected in a way.
And Yasmin here, you have to read her book.
Exactly,
on
the Second World War is thinking.
Yeah, I did the sequel, so what happens next? Yeah, because there are so many parallels for sure.
And also when you were saying the largest voluntary army, there's a Second World War, isn't it?
Yes,
Yeah.
2.5 million.
The biggest.
Yeah. And the well, there is just so many parallels, but the major difference from my point of view is the political context, because by that point you don't have Gandhi going around recruiting. You have the Indian political establishment is completely against cooperation in the war at that point, and so it creates a much more sort of complex. And you also have the Japanese, so the war comes to India's door. India. But that's another story. I think we have time for one more, perhaps, before we wrap up.
Fabulous afternoon talk. I was just wondering about, I love the way you talk about the troops from different religions still being together and united, and at the same time, the fact that different food preparations and all the rest. So I was wondering, whether they were actually divided into different regiments and when they could mix, or whether that was encouraged. If you could just say a little bit more about that, it would be fascinating. Thank you.
So there were religious elements in all the regiments. They were not divided on religious grounds, but they would get what they, whatever faith they followed, they would be looked after. And Hindus couldn't be cremated in the war fields. Many of them had to be buried. And there was one of these in the early days. Later they started cremating them. And there's this lovely letter from one of the Garhwalis, or was it a Sikh? No, it was a Sikh soldier. And he tells his officer that, I don't mind, if you have to, I know I can't be cremated. If you have to bury me, that's fine. Just leave my boots outside. Don't bury me in my shoes. So that was the religious sentiment that he didn't want to take. So, there's just so many little things. But they all...
And it's these little things that often matter, because again, the kitchens were separate, and this is in France. I was reading, in fact, this is in the British Library. This man is saying that, it had been raining for the last 2 days, and basically our kitchen was washed out. So we had to go to the Muslims' kitchen and cook, but that is fine, it's times of war, and we are all brothers together. So how paradoxical it tells, though in the Second World War, I don't know, is it more pronounced?
The difference? No, I don't think so.
I don't
think so. I mean, you have it's similar, it runs in both directions, I think.
Right.
But I think what you find is, under conditions of when people are under fire, when they're having to work together
They
on
all
a front
come
line,
together.
that at that moment of pressure,
Absolutely.
these kind of things dissolve more than and they
The
exist more when
paradox
people,
of
yeah,
war.
there's a
There's a
paradox
gentleman
that-
there from
yeah.
Hong
No,
Kong.
Yasmin, you might know, but my understanding is that the Indian National Army
Yes.
in Singapore had a common kitchen precisely to.
Oh, really?
To
Right.
And yeah, because
Right,
Yeah.
Marsh
okay.
Bose said that, look, you guys have to eat pork, beef, whatever is on your plate, eat.
Eat.
Yeah, I mean, there's always an ideal and a reality. I mean,
Yeah.
these two things run
Yeah.
alongside each other.
That's
But I think certainly it's one of the ways that the INA is trying to reach out is to kind of go across divisions of religion and of caste as well.
After the siege of Kut, they had to eat their mules, so they may
exactly,
have
the
been.
horse meat,
There was no food, and they had, as they walked, they had to kill their horses.
Horses
and eat them.
absolutely.
So,
No,
I'm
I
sure
think
that-
that's not just about Indians, it's just general
It's
conditions
general,
of war. You
exactly.
have to
You just
survive in conditions of war.
Yeah. So,
And there's a lot of demonstration of affection also among men, because when you're under fire, that's you have each other, that's all you have.
that's all you have. Yeah.
Well, thank you both very much for you sort of making war so much more than just battle, I think, you know, and for showing the nuances of war beyond the fighting fronts and beyond the battlefield, and for foregoing the cricket. Yeah,
So what's the score? What's the score?
13 for no loss, Pakistan.
Right.
Okay.
One wicket
One
down.
wicket down.
Right.
So if you join me in thanking our speakers, Shrabani, Basu and Santanu.